Behind this unmarked garage door, pulling out onto the streets of Palo Alto, California, is a fleet of cars mounted with cameras, helping Google to map the world, something it's now been doing for 20 years.
Here is where we're both repairing, building the cameras, keeping them maintained.
Google's cameras have taken billions of images to map millions of miles in more than 100 countries. And they've come a long way since Street View images first published in 2007.
Yeah, it's actually probably crazy to think about that maps in general have gotten so much better than they used to be, and just how much data Google has in order to map literally like every single street in the entire world is insane. Like, that'd just be so much data and have so much certainty in kind of how our infrastructure is built. That's definitely been beneficial to consumers for being able to get their maps, but also it can just show like how powerful some of these companies can get over time.
This is our very first camera system. It's 500 pounds, and we needed a forklift to put it on top of the van.
By 2008, the 9 camera systems were 75 pounds, mounted on everything from snowmobiles to tricycles.
So this allowed us to open up Europe. Europe has a lot of pedestrian areas, and we can't drive through those.
In 2010 came 15 camera 50-pound spheres, wearable by backpackers, underwater divers, even camels. And in 2018 came an even lighter 40-pound system I tried wearing on my back.
This is like what it's like to backpack with a baby. Yeah. We went to Grand Canyon and Machu Picchu, places that you can only really walk into.
With more than 2 billion monthly users, Google Maps is the world's top navigation app. And now Alphabet-owned Maps is using generative AI to keep ahead of the pack, with new consumer-facing features and AI analysis of billions of images to keep the map up to date.
We're making 100 million updates to the map every single day. It's phenomenal.
We went to Silicon Valley for a ride-along with Google's mapping fleet and a first-ever on-camera look at the Street View Service Center, where we sat down with the head of Maps to talk traffic, data privacy, and all the changes coming thanks to generative AI. There was a time when paper maps were king. Then it was MapQuest printouts and standalone GPS units from companies like Garmin and TomTom. Then in 2005, Google made a bold move into maps, following an idea from co-founder Larry Page.
This is where we started mapping. About 20 years ago, Larry drove down some of these streets with a video camera and handed it to someone and said, "Hey, what can you do with this?"
Maria Biggs has been with Google for more than 10 years. She drove us around its headquarters in a car equipped with the latest generation Street View camera, first introduced in 2022. It's the first Street View camera that can be used on any car rather than being built in.
As you can imagine, if it's not tied to a specific car, we can rent a car, say, like an island. So we're going to Hawaii with these next generation camera systems because we don't have to ship the whole car.
Street View cameras are a significant part of how Google gathers data for maps, but it also relies on satellite and aerial images, 1,000+ third-party sources, and info from local governments and directly from Maps users. All this allows it to offer maps in a whopping 250+ countries and territories. Now, the more nimble cameras are helping Google make updates to dozens of those countries and map at least 3 new ones: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Namibia, and Liechtenstein.
We can easily just take it to the next island without having to ship the entire car. And so some places that we haven't refreshed, collected in, say, 10 years, we're going to be able to easily.
That's pretty crazy. So they are still continuing to take more and more pictures throughout the world. Theoretically, this would allow, especially like with things like Street View and other resources that they have, like they theoretically could like make a 3D model that is 100% or let's say 99% accurate, because people will move around and things might move around, but Google probably could make a true 3D model of the entire world as it stands today, which is just a crazy thought to think of, just how large scale that is and to what grade of detail they have with some of these cameras. This is pretty cool. I haven't really thought about this too much in the past, so I'm definitely appreciative of this segment.
Move these cameras around.
It used to be an extremely manual pipeline for any digital map maker, but increasingly you have these various IoT devices, this combination of sensing, processing, and connectivity that allows you to update this map file more automatically and therefore potentially more cheaply and in a way that is ultimately more scalable.
The way it works now, Big says, is the cameras record images locally as they're driven around by a fleet of Street View employees who ingest the images once they return to a hub, like this Street View garage in Palo Alto.
How many other garages like this are there around the world? So we have 3 total, one in each region, one in APAC, one in Europe, and one here.
Also on site here is the Street View Service Center.
This is where all of the cameras come through when they move from different locations. This is a next-gen camera system where it has been to Australia. We did some really extreme testing in really hot tropical areas. And so we bring it back and we make sure everything's still functional. We clean it up before it goes back out to another country.
More images and more detail from the new cameras also provide a rich data set for Google's AI models, resulting in a flurry of new consumer-facing features in the last couple years. One is Immersive View. Think of it like a supercharged version of Street View, using AI to fuse together billions of Street View and aerial images to show a lifelike preview of each step on the route.
We use the imagery and neural radiance fields, which is a generative AI technique, to actually take a photo and transform it into a 3D representation of a place. So almost like you can look into a restaurant, and we overlay the conditions, like what is the actual, how busy it is and what the weather might be, air quality.
That is actually pretty cool.
And in October, Google announced a bunch more AI features. One major one, Maps, is now enabled with Gemini, Google's generative AI chatbot.
Where could I watch Sunday's football game while drinking a beer and bring my dog?
Here you go. There's all these places that show up. This is historically kind of hard information to find, and now with a quick tap, you can learn about it.
Chris Phillips joined Google in 2021 to head up all of Geo, the division in charge of Maps. He showed us some of the newest AI features.
This place has 2,000 reviews. Kind of a lot of reading to do. We summarize it using Gemini for you right away.
Gemini.
Actually, the summaries I've started to notice in a few areas like Google Maps. I've seen it in like reviews as well for like products, for example. Those I actually find super helpful. Again, because you can basically just skim the summary and it will tell you what people are generally thinking about it, usually some positive, some negative, and what you might be looking out for. So this is what I used to spend a lot of time on. Maybe you all do the same thing, which is you look at a few good reviews, make sure that there's a good amount of positivity. Then you also generally like to check negative reviews and see what are the things that could go wrong with this product, for instance, and like what should I be looking out for when I get it, and are those must-have features for me, or could I live with that negative that exists? And so just being able to read those summaries have been massively helpful. I feel like that's been a great addition for AI usage.
Is also enabling voice-activated reports in Waze, which Google bought in 2013 for $1.3 billion.
I'm gonna try it out. There's some construction out bad.
Construction reported.
To get consumers to actually use these things, they need to be easy to use, and a voice interface is the best kind of interface that you can have in the cabin. It allows you to keep your eyes out on the road. It allows you to keep your hands on the wheel.
In Google Earth, Gemini is enabling custom visualizations that can help with high-level city planning tasks.
They might want to be thinking about where should we put EV charging stations in this area. And we can help them map quickly with looking at where's the current EV charging, what are the different stores and shops. They can overlay information around population and quickly do the surveying work and help them do that to make those decisions faster.
On public transit, there are now delay reports, alternate routes, and details like subway entrance locations. And in navigation, AI is enabling real-time reports of weather disruptions like unplowed roads, flooded areas, and spots with low visibility.
And then we have this new arrival experience where when you get to your destination, we can help you with not just where to park, but even that last step of walking along the way.
While AI helps curate these details into an updated experience, it's being fed real-time data that often comes from you, the users.
We have over 500 million people who are contributing updates to the map every day. That's things like reviews or keeping the hours up to date, and even like what to expect as far as issues on the road on the way there.
But users also provide data to Google Maps passively too. Traffic delays, for instance, are predicted in part using live information like speed and drive time from the millions of drivers who use Maps each day.
So what was it like on this roadway on this day of the week at this time of day? What is that historical pattern? And we use anonymized data, so it's not linked to any individual user, so we aggregate that information to know the historical trend.
Data ownership and data privacy have always been, one of the major perception barriers that Google has had to overcome.
Over the years, Google has put in safeguards to help.
We built technology to blur faces and even blur things like license plates.
Location history is valuable data for Google, but users can now turn off location history or delete places they've been. And some, like abortion clinics or domestic violence shelters, are auto-deleted. And in a privacy-conscious move in December, Google started keeping location history on device instead of in the cloud tied to users' Google accounts, making it tougher for authorities to access location history. And users can request blurring an area on Street View, say to prevent thieves from analyzing their property. But there is an upside to all this data too. It gives Google a lot of power to warn drivers of hazards.
Especially when you have conditions happening like a flooded road, and we can surface it for other drivers in almost real time. It really does make a difference in helping avoid what could be other problems happening on the road.
Hopefully they're going to go back to the data privacy segment. They seem to cover it quickly and then reference something else. But this was also something that got brought up for Chinese companies because autonomous vehicles generally also have a lot of cameras around them. And so this is potentially where maybe Street View potentially even inspired some of the ideas behind autonomous vehicles, but you get to see a lot of the world around you on this vehicle. Like, that's the entire point. And for Chinese automotive companies, especially the autonomous vehicle space, US was very worried about what those companies were doing with the data that they were getting, because they could be driving by government buildings, they could be driving by like the personal residence of government figures or political figures or whatever it is. And so that could be suspicious, or like main traffic areas or transportation locations. And so they didn't really seem to cover that as much with Google here. Obviously, they have their own representative saying that they make good decisions with their data privacy, but of course that's going to be the company's policy. That's what the spokesperson for the company is always going to say. And so it feels like they're going pretty soft here on this segment. They basically just said, people have been worried about this in the past. Here's a person who is paid for from Google to say that it's going to be okay, don't worry about it. And so hopefully they're going to dig in more here, but this is something that could be a problem even for Google. Like, Google theoretically could learn things about our government and potentially use that information to potentially impact decision making, things like that. And so I think that it's fair to be concerned about China in this case, that they have previously mentioned, but they don't seem to be covering Google as much here, because theoretically anybody with so much information, they also have a lot of power, from the old adage of knowledge is power. That is true. Like, Google could do so many things with this information that are potentially not in our best interest, but in their best interest. And so they haven't really covered that, but it is something to be mindful of, which is when you give somebody else your data, you should generally assume that it's not an if there's going to be a problem with your data being leaked, it's more of a when. Just because people are going to try gathering that data externally, so like maybe hackers, things like that. But then there's also who the company chooses to give your data to. So a lot of companies work with third-party vendors, and so they'll just sign some pieces of paper and say, yeah, I did a good job of it, you're going to do a good job of it, here's a copy of all of my customers' data. And then boom, now there's 2 copies, and you never knew about this other party existing. And now there's 2 different locations that could be hacked, or somebody else could leak, or something bad could happen to it. And even those vendors could pass it on to someone else, and so on and so forth, in the exact same way that it happened the first time, which is they signed some papers behind the scenes. They don't even have to tell Google at that point, just saying like, well, we've been upholding our standards, we're working with somebody else. They signed them, no big deal. And so this is where like a leak is almost eventual and inevitable. And so that would be my advice to people, which is if you're giving anyone your data, you should assume that it will eventually be leaked or potentially even used in a nefarious purpose. It's just a matter of time, because again, this is where trying to make something secure forever is a really hard challenge. Making things secure at a particular time or doing a good job of it is easy. And this is where in the security space and technology, broadly speaking, there's like a term called basically like how many nines or how many nines you want for something. And this generally refers to like uptime security, things like that, of like 90% versus 99% versus 99.9%. And this is where you could be saying to yourself, well, 99.9% that's basically 100%, but it isn't. And that's where if you are having millions of people's data and you're saying that you have secured 99.9% of it, that's still thousands or tens of thousands or more of people whose data got leaked. And so this is where even doing a really, really phenomenal job at keeping these things secure, it's never going to be impossible. It will be impossible for anyone to perfectly secure your data for all time. So it's just something that you should be cognizant of and cautious of whenever you give your personal information to anybody.
Google Maps gets updated with data from Waze, where reporting is core to the experience for loyal users.
Built into just the DNA of Waze is this idea of two-way interaction and what has been a very virtuous cycle for Waze and therefore indirectly for Google.
You're continually adding updates on what you see happening on the road, and we'll give you some more provocative maneuvers along the way when you're deciding, beating the traffic and getting around.
But alternate routes have also worsened traffic in some neighborhoods, where small roads can be ill-equipped to handle many cars.
We use public roads that are available for driving, and we work constantly with the local authorities, the different agencies that are responsible for transportation, and they help us with what are the rules for the specific roads, and we follow those.
The use of these navigation apps, whether embedded or on smartphone devices, is almost universal. And so we are approaching a point where there needs to be kind of a more broader, almost fleet level view, considering how can we use these services to optimize traffic flow from a social point of view, rather than just different individuals trying to gain an advantage over each other.
And there's a risk tied to how reliant users have become on Google Maps when it can't get everything right. In one extreme example, a man died when he drove off a collapsed bridge in North Carolina in 2022. His family sued Google, alleging Maps suggested the route despite being warned of the collapse 2 years prior.
Wow, that's pretty unfortunate. Definitely you should be mindful of the road around you. I'm not sure if Google ended up winning or losing this case, because this is a situation where a lot of companies still try to put the ownership onto the users and the drivers in this case. Again, referencing autonomous vehicles, this is also a similar situation where there aren't really many hands-free autonomous vehicle settings. And so I think in some cases, most of the time you have to have your hands on the wheel. And this is basically ways of enforcing ownership onto the driver themselves. And so this is a gray area. If Google said, hey, you should go in this direction, and this person didn't look at the road at all, it's unclear the exact scenario that's here, but it seems like you should be able to see that something's coming there, and you shouldn't trust any source 100% to the point where you're potentially putting your own life at risk.
International destinations pose their own challenges. In Jakarta, for example, ride-hailing app Grab is making its own map of the Indonesian capital's complex streets after its delivery drivers complained that Google Maps often got it wrong.
When you set the challenge of mapping everywhere rather than just in the major markets where things are most commercially viable, that is a real challenge for any map maker.
But now, with AI and nimble new cameras, that could change.
Because we won't have to rely on these big rigs and all this equipment. We can have a smaller unit that can get to more places.
But already, in major markets, Google Maps dominates by staying up to date with accurate road details, something that was notoriously lacking when the top competitor, Apple Maps, launched in 2012.
Feels like a half-baked product, the data isn't great, and it's not the quality and the experience you would expect from an Apple product.
CEO Tim Cook.
Yeah, this was a big thing when the Apple Maps first came out, was that they were just so unreliable. And I think Apple also basically defaulted this as the option as soon as they had it. And so this was a huge topic of debate at this time. So many years ago now, it's crazy to think that this is literally over a decade now that this was happening. Feels pretty recent for some of us older folks, but yeah, it's interesting to think about. But yeah, making a map and keeping it up to date, because obviously every street isn't going to move or every building isn't going to move on a regular basis. but because as you look at a larger and larger area, some change is going to happen. And so the larger the area, the more change that is possible. And also the frequency at which you're taking a look at those maps and you're updating those maps is going to impact it. So if you look at an area once a year, there's a good chance something is different. If you look at every 5 years, there's a good chance that something's wrong or a sizable portion of it is wrong, for instance. And so this is where the frequency of updates and the size and area that you're covering increases that chance. And so I definitely remember Apple coming into this space and struggling quite a bit originally.
Officially issuing an apology for the Maps app. Cook saying, quote, "With the launch of our new Maps last week, we fell short on our commitment to our customers."
Today, Apple Maps has come a long way, with some estimates putting it around 500 million monthly users, although it's far behind the 2 billion monthly users Google Maps has acquired since 2005, when its deep data set made it unique among maps.
I think what made it so revolutionary was the search capability, combined with the completeness of that location database and it being an exploration tool and a solution to find something that you didn't even necessarily know where it might be or the address for it.
But how much Google spends on Maps and how much money Maps makes is unclear. Google's parent company Alphabet doesn't break out Maps in its earnings reports, rather clumping it with other major services like Search and YouTube. One of the only estimates comes from a 2019 Morgan Stanley report, forecasting Maps would go from $2.95 billion in revenue in 2019 to $11 billion in 2020.
That's definitely quite a bit of growth, going from shy of $3 billion in 2019 to $11 billion in 2023. Likely the reason why those systems were all bucketed together, I think they had basically like the Play Store, YouTube, Google Maps. This is likely because all of these systems are paid for through advertisements. And so likely that's the reason why, which is effectively for them is just we are creating a location where customers go to gather information, and then we sell advertisement space to advertisers based off of the usage of these products. And so it's based off of the contracts of the advertisements themselves. There's not an inherent cost associated with those systems. And so that's likely why they bucketed those together. It's not likely a nefarious purpose in any way. It's probably just simplest to say, we have all these services. They might even pay for and charge advertisers for one flat rate across some of these things, or have it all integrated with like their standard advertisement platform. And so that's likely why they added those together. The way that they reported on that made it sound like this was like some underhanded way of reporting. But that's likely not the case. It's probably just easier for reporting purposes. And especially having worked on systems in the past, especially systems where the usage is disjoint from the revenue source. Something that's more clearly aligned would be like if you're in a marketplace and somebody goes through a transaction flow and then they pay for that thing, it's easier to attribute costs and revenue to that type of model. But if you're doing something where, like in the case of YouTube or Google Maps, where users use the system, they may or may not see an ad, or they might see many ads versus very few ads, and that each of those vary based off of your location and what you're looking for, then it gets really hard to figure out like how much is that ad earning versus like the usage there. And so it's probably just easier to bucket those together, especially if there's some joint overlapping infrastructure across them.
23. That's a big chunk of the $18.3 billion in total estimated revenue of the whole navigation app sector in 2023. How it makes money largely boils down to one word: advertising.
Do certain results float up higher if they are advertisers with Google?
So we're always focused on giving people the result when they're searching for a restaurant or a place that most accurately fits what they're searching for. So we're always going to narrow it down into what you're looking for. And merchants have the opportunity to actually pay for advertising in order for their place to show up in that list.
It shouldn't even be readily apparent to the consumer that they're being advertised to. It could be giving priority to certain search results. It could also be something as simple as...
Yeah, that guy basically like didn't answer the question really. So that likely is a yes. For what it's worth, this is where if you are somebody who's paying for the service, and obviously like Google needs these advertisers to pay them in order for their system to keep functioning, they're likely going to give them some preferential treatment, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to explain to your customer why whatever they spent on their business and for advertising with you was worth it to them. And so one of the easiest ways to do that is just to like give them a little boost and say like, hey, check out all this traffic you got after you subscribe to us. And that's going to be way easier than necessarily just charging, because you might do a combination of charging for advertisements and potentially boosting them up based off of how much they use your advertising platform.
Showing logos and branding in little POI pin drop visualizations.
Another moneymaker for Maps, selling a software interface with detailed data to solar companies looking for new customers. Think highly accurate rooftop images, measurements, elevation, and shading for 480 million plus buildings across 40 countries. Google also sells access to its Maps platform to developers from the likes of Wayfair and Domino's, who've built more than 10 million sites and apps for things like food delivery, ride sharing, and real estate. One example, in 2019, Uber said it paid Google $58 million for its mapping technology over the previous 3 years. And Google's Android Automotive operating system, with Maps, of course, powers the infotainment systems in mini cars by makers like Polestar, Volvo, Honda, GM, and Ford.
Speed limit changes, number of lane changes, road geometry changes. We all know how frustrating it can be when that gets out of date in our cars. And so automakers want the absolute best there.
And as robotaxis and self-driving go mainstream, accurate mapping is crucial, and naturally a business opportunity for Google too.
Alphabet has Waymo, who are slowly but surely becoming very successful in the robotaxi space, expanding their geographic footprint. And very famously, they use digital maps as a key part of their technology workflow there.
Waymo dominated the US robotaxi market in 2024, and passengers in Phoenix can hail one of the fully autonomous cars directly from the Google Maps app. As for what's next, AI and self-driving cars themselves could, eventually, be a better alternative to the user reports that help keep Waze popular and Google Maps accurate.
I think an ambition for Waymo, and something that we see from almost every other autonomous vehicle platform provider, is to try to close that loop and to use the same vehicles that benefit from the map to also contribute to the creation of that map. It could also just be a lot more reliable and exhaustive because you're not relying on a human being to notice something.
Is there any future where the Google mapping is happening on self-driven cars without a driver? I mean, that would be a great thing to do, right? Because then they're collecting a lot of places where people are going. And so that would be great. But there's not yet. No plans. Got it.
She technically didn't answer there, so that might be a maybe. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.